Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the AYANEO Kun. Now this is a large handheld PC. It's got an 8.4 inch screen. It has trackpads, which is kind of unique, but then also has this kickstand as well. Now AYANEO is a company known for making larger scale devices, both in terms of features as well as price, and this one is positioned as being kind of the ultimate AYANEO. This thing has some features I've never seen on other handhelds before, but it also comes at a very high price. We're looking at about $1,000 for the cheapest model and $1,700 for the highest end. That's actually the review unit they sent out to me. This thing has a whopping 64 gigabytes of RAM and 4 terabytes of storage. So this is very high end and definitely outside of kind of my own pay grade. This is not something that I would buy myself. All the same, the way I'm looking at it is that if this is an ultimate device, you're going to be paying $1,700 for that. That's like, you can get a very nice PC for that price. Then this thing has to be ultimate in every single way. And so I am going to kind of look at it through that lens, in the sense that I expect this to basically fulfill all of my needs. If I'm going to spend that much money on a device like this, it better do everything and it better do it well. So that's what we're going to look at in this video here. Does it justify that higher price point of over $1,000 and somewhere in that range between $1,000 and $1,700? Anyway, lots to cover in this video here, and I hope I'll answer all of your questions as we go through. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, let's get started with the specs. This is running a Ryzen 7 7840U, so that's the top-of-the-line CPU available right now with integrated graphics. And we also have a variety of RAM and storage options depending on the model that you get, but the lowest tier option will have 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. Of note here, the review unit that was sent over to me does not have the highest spec RAM available. It's 6400 megatransfers per second. However, I have been told that they're working on a BIOS update which will allow you to have higher speed RAM. Now, one of the unique properties of the AYANEO Kun is the display. It's 8.4 inches with a 2560 by 1600 resolution. So this is definitely the largest screen that AYANEO has released to date. Of note, this is an LCD panel with a 60 Hz refresh rate. Another large component of this device is the battery. It is 75 watt hours. That's nearly double the Asus ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. But of course, with the larger display and battery, we also are going to contend with more weight. This is 950 grams. That is over 2 pounds in weight. In terms of connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2. These are standards now with these high-end handheld PCs. And you can also purchase an optional 4G LTE module if you want to use this on the go outside of your home. It also ships with Windows 11 Home and a couple other features. For example, it has a front-facing camera so that you can log into your computer with just your face. And this is also the first AYANEO device that has touchpads. We'll talk more about that later. Now, AYANEO has positioned this as being their high-end or ultimate model. So let's talk about some of the things that really do kind of make this an ultimate machine. The first is going to be the unboxing experience. It's kind of ridiculous when you actually look at it. It comes in a wooden box and has a beautiful design to it, but also comes with a bunch of tech jargon and then also some epic poetry as well. Regardless, they are definitely pushing that high-class atmosphere when unboxing this device. Now inside, it's basically the same as any other AYANEO product, so you'll have things like your USB-C charging cable, and they've also got some USB-C adapters, as well as a plug for Antarctica if you need it. The only tangible difference between the unboxing experience here is the 100-watt charger that comes with it. This is pretty great because it has 4 different plugs, so you can use it in a variety of use cases. Anyway, the other main thing that makes this thing ultimate is just its overall size. As you can see right here, it is huge and has a pretty nice design to it as well. It very much so reminds me of the Steam Deck in terms of design and feel. It also feels like they've upgraded the plastics. This one has a more powdery touch to it. It feels really nice and kind of soft in the hands. And in my couple weeks of testing, it didn't seem to pick up any fingerprints at all, so I think that's really great. Looking at the front, we have a function button on the top left and then a Face ID camera right here below it. And this works out pretty well in terms of being able to log in without having to input a PIN. Also of note, on the bottom are our select and start buttons. We'll talk about those more later. On the other side, we have an additional function button on the top right. And then we have our standard AYANEO function buttons on the bottom right. One is a quick menu and the other one will show the desktop. Now this company is usually very good when it comes to high quality analog sticks, and these are no different. These do have a Hall sensor magnetic connection and a nice glide to them as well. We've seen these in other products, so no complaints here. They also stick out quite a bit from the device, which means they're going to feel nice and precise when you're actually using them. Now one thing that is unique about the AYANEO Kun is this new D-pad design. They're calling it a floating 8-way D-pad. And essentially it feels a lot like what you would find on an Xbox Series controller, but without that clicky resistance. And initially it was a little bit odd, like I felt like I wasn't getting enough feedback when I was actually using it, but it turns out in practice it doesn't really matter at all. In fact, I found that this was one of the best D-pads I've ever used on a handheld bar none. So in terms of just ultimate quality, yeah, this is actually pretty great. When it comes to playing D-pad-centric fighting games, something like the Capcom series, I was able to do Hadoukens and Shoryukens absolutely no problem whatsoever. In fact, this D-pad was a genuine pleasure to use with fighting games. I think one of the best I've ever actually tried. So it is 100% Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. Not only that, I think the tuning here is absolutely perfect for platformers. It passes my Contra test with just a little bit of waggle in the fact that I'm not getting accidental diagonals. And when trying it with precision platforming games like Celeste, yeah, it's absolutely great. So yes, this is one of those times where AYANEO's marketing materials actually do follow through. This is an incredibly good D-pad. Another thing that's been upgraded are the face buttons, and these are also very good. In fact, let's just get right down to the hard truth. These feel exactly like Steam Deck buttons. They're glossy, same size, and same amount of travel. And I'm sure that AYANEO is not happy with me saying that, but yeah, it just kind of feels like they've copied that, and honestly, I think it's a great move. If anything, I would say they're just a tad more responsive than the Steam Deck buttons, and I think in that regard, it's actually a very good thing. And this is a huge leap in quality from their previous devices. If you look at a previous device like the AYANEO Air 1S, you will see that they have a more squarish design, and I've always felt like these buttons are too small and the travel is too high. So in that regard, I would say that yes, the AYANEO Kun buttons are the best I've ever seen from this company. Now the top design here is very similar to other devices they've created, but they have upgraded their shoulder and trigger buttons, and I think that's worth noting as well. The triggers are nice and big and easy to press down on, but they don't have excessive travel to them. That's another thing that I've had criticisms about with their other devices. So again, I think they've tweaked these triggers to perfection to the point where I am very happy with this design. In fact, when it comes to just overall ergonomics, this is a very comfortable handheld. It has a nice rounded feel to it, everything feels nice in place. With other AYANEO devices, I always felt like I was kind of holding them wrong or that I just didn't really get the design. However, from the moment I picked up the AYANEO Kun, all of the ergonomics made sense. The shoulder buttons are also well made, they are large and easy to press down on, and they're at a different height than the triggers, so there's not going to be any sort of accidental presses. So yes, overall when it comes to just feel and ergonomics, this is easily the best AYANEO device I've ever held. All the buttons are easy to access, and it is a genuine joy to actually play all of these games. Now the ergonomics are not perfect, specifically when it comes to these touchpads. I don't think they're actually designed to be used while in-game, so if you're looking for a Steam Deck replacement where you can actually play the trackpads while in-game, I think you still have to go with the Valve device. These are more suited for navigation within Windows. We'll talk about this more later. While we're here, let's also go over the I/O. We have two programmable function buttons here on the edges of both of the shoulders. This is something we've seen with other AYANEO devices before. And then on the left, we have our power button, which also has a fingerprint sensor. And then we have our volume buttons up and down, a small hole for the microphone, and then an LED charging indicator. After that, we've got a USB 4 port capable of video out, and then also a USB-A port. And then finally on the right, we have our large exhaust vent. On the bottom, we have our holes for the speaker, as well as some grills to kind of help with that audio. And then we have a headphone jack and another USB 4 port. And I feel like they have upgraded the overall audio, and it might be because of those grill holes that we have on the bottom. Either way, let's go ahead and take a quick listen. I still wouldn't call this audio ultimate. I think it still is a little bit muffled, but it's at least a little bit better than the previous models they've released. While we're on the subject of audio, let's do a quick fan noise test at max speed. I think the noise here is pretty good. I would say it's about the level of an ROG Ally and not quite as loud as a Steam Deck. Okay, and finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this section where we're talking about all the things that make this device ultimate is the battery life. First thing I wanted to mention that it takes about 2 hours to charge it from 0 to 100%, and that is with a 100-watt charger. I also found that it retained its battery life pretty well. When in sleep mode, I lost about 2% over the course of 8 hours. Now let's talk about a best case scenario and work our way up from there. So starting on the right, we have SteamWorld Dig 2. Now the device can go all the way down to 5 watts, but I found that basically no game will actually play at that speed. Instead, 7 watts seem to be the minimum for these lightweight games. settings. Either way, at a full 1600p resolution at default settings, I got an average of 60 frames per second, and I got a little bit under 6 hours of gameplay with this game. The next threshold was 12 watts. This works really well with Nintendo Wii U, as well as PlayStation 2 and GameCube when upscaled. So we're looking here at a 1080p resolution and max frame rate. And at this level, I got a little bit under 5 hours of gameplay. I still think that's pretty good for high-end emulation. Moving on from there, the next threshold I want to use was my standard cap for PC gaming. 18 watts seems to be really the sweet spot when it comes to this chipset in terms of performance and battery life. So here I played a more cinematic game, so Death Stranding at a 30 frames per second cap, but at 1080p with high settings. And the game was gorgeous when I was playing it, and I got over 3.5 hours of battery life, so I think that's still going to be a really great experience. Now moving on from there, let's really try to push things. So I'm going to do Baldur's Gate 3 at a 25 watt TDP. As I'll show you in my PC game testing, this is kind of the max that I think you'll get in terms of return on investment when it comes to wattage and battery life. Either way, I was able to play this at a max resolution of 1600p on low settings, and it still looked great. We weren't getting a full 60 frames per second, but I bet you could cap it at about 40 and have a great time. And here I got a little bit under 2 hours of gameplay altogether. Now finally, we have our worst case scenario. This is where I'm maxing out the TDP, which surprisingly is 54 watts on this handheld. Here I played Cyberpunk 2077 at 1200p resolution with low settings, and I got an average frame rate of about 51 frames per second. So overall, I'm very impressed with this battery life. I love the fact that I can play at about 18 watts and get over 3.5 hours of game time. So if you are looking for a big handheld with big battery life, then yes, this is going to fit that bill. However, like I mentioned in the intro, they are promoting this as being a high-end ultimate experience, but there are a few things that I wouldn't really consider very ultimate. So let's take a few minutes and actually walk through some of those things that kind of took away from that overall experience. We'll start here with the trackpads. Now these have the same feel as the plastic shell themselves, but they are indented a little bit so you will know when you're actually pressing down on them. They also provide a generic haptic feedback when you're touching them, so you'll get that other response as well. Now by default, the left trackpad will act as a scroll wheel, and then if you press on any of the corners, it'll give you the direction keys. And then the right trackpad will act as a mouse cursor, but then also a left and right click depending on where you press on it. Now my main complaint about these is that when turned on, they can be very distracting while playing a game with traditional controls. And for me, this was especially bad on the right side. There were many times where my palm would just barely graze that touchpad, and that would have some pretty bad consequences depending on the game. In Baldur's Gate 3, it'll instantly remove you from the controller mode and put you into mouse and keyboard mode. And so then you'll have to wiggle the controls again to get back into that same mode, and that can be very distracting. In other games like Doom Eternal, just tapping on that touchpad barely will actually register as a gun firing. And for me, this happened all the time to the point where I found this game to be unplayable. It was especially annoying when I was low on ammo. Additionally, many of the emulators that you might want to try on this have a feature where if you click on the screen itself, it'll take you out of full screen mode. In particular, I found this to happen very often with PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 games. And to make matters worse, when I was playing a game where I would repeatedly be pressing on the face buttons, that was when I would activate the trackpads the most often. So as you can imagine, those games where I'm just kind of mashing on the buttons because it's a big action scene, I would get fully removed from that overall experience by having to go back into full screen back and forth. Now luckily, as of the day that I'm making this finalized review, they do have a software update. And this does include touchpad settings, so you can go in there and customize them however you would like. In fact, you can set any of these 4-way directionals to any key that you can think of. In addition, these settings has the option to just turn them off altogether. Now I did find that this software update was a little bit buggy and that sometimes even when turning things off it would still register, but all the same I do have the confidence that AYANEO is working on an update here, and so this might be a moot point sometime in the future. However, one thing I don't think this software is going to fix is the fact that I just didn't find the touchpads to be very responsive or accurate. For example, here with Riva Tuner, I'm trying to move this scroll wheel a little bit to the right. And this should be a very easy thing if you were using an actual mouse, but I found it to be just about impossible with these touchpads. They're just not very responsive or precise. So the ironic thing here is that most of the time I did not use the touchpads at all. Instead, I used the touchscreen. And that's one of the benefits of having a bigger screen is that you can kind of blow things up and it's a little bit easier to use with your finger. Another quote-unquote upgrade that I found with the AYANEO Kun that didn't really feel like an upgrade were these 2 back buttons. Now you can program these in the software, you can make them anything you would like, and so I don't really have an issue with these from a software perspective. Instead, I just don't think that they're very ergonomically placed. For me, they're just a little bit too low to the point where the bottom buttons I actually have to use my pinkies to actually press down on them, and I think that's just not a very good move. For me, I always use my pinkies to stabilize myself when using a handheld. It's not something I would want to use to actually press a button. And so in that regard, I basically turned off these back buttons and didn't use them at all. And it's kind of a shame because I think if they were better placed, I would probably use them more often. Now let's take the opportunity to also talk about the back. Now obviously we have a large fan intake here on the left, and this does keep the device nice and cool under a heavy load. Also underneath the kickstand, we have a microSD card slot, which I think is great. I love having expanded storage. And this little sticker right here is actually covering where the 4G LTE module will go if you happen to buy that upgrade. Next, I want to talk about the kickstand itself, because I do appreciate the fact that we have a kickstand, and this really only extends to one specific length, and I found myself wishing that it was a little bit wider. For example, when I'm playing a large handheld like this in tabletop mode, I prefer to keep it at a wider angle. This allows me to rest my arms and wrists on the table itself, but then also have a nice angle for my face. And if we had a kickstand that would kind of hold it in place right here, I think it would enhance that experience. However, the kickstand here on the AYANEO Kun is in a much more upright position. And I think that'll work fine if you're using it in tabletop mode like this with an external controller. But the thing is, this has such nice controls right there on the device that I'd rather actually hold it at a lower angle and have it in handheld mode, but with that kickstand. So I think that's a minor gripe. I appreciate the fact that they have a kickstand, but I just wish it did have a little bit more angle to it. Another thing I found to be less than ideal with the design are these two function buttons here on the top left and right. The top left one will function as an Xbox button. This is something that I rarely actually will need, but it's taking up a prime space on this handheld. Same thing with the top right button. This actually just brings up your ISpace quick menu. It's the exact same thing that the bottom right button does as well. Now, the fact that we have these two function buttons that are not very functional is not a really big concern for me. The thing that annoys me about it is their placement, because these would be perfect for start and select. Instead, they put those buttons on the bottom left. And I can't overstate how many times I accidentally pressed the function buttons because I thought they were start and select. So it's a relatively minor thing from a design standpoint, but it does take away from that ultimate experience for me. And finally, the last thing that surprised me as not being a very ultimate experience was the screen itself. There's a couple things at play right here. Number one is the fact that we have a very large screen, but as far as I can tell, it has zero anti-glare features. So when you're playing it in a brightly lit environment like here in my studio, it becomes basically a mirror in terms of its reflection. This is something that other companies have recognized and taken measures to prevent. For example, the ROG Ally has an anti-glare coating to it, which I think works really well while still keeping it nice and crisp. And of course, the screen on the high-end version of the Steam Deck has that etched glass, which also is anti-reflective. Now, neither of these screens will prevent all reflections, but they are much easier to use in a brightly lit environment compared to the AYANEO Kun. And honestly, on its own, this is not a deal breaker for me, but the other thing that I didn't like about the screen was the actual quality of the brightness and colors. Now here I am at the lowest brightness possible, and you can see that the bright segments here are washed out. To me, this is an indication that they've configured the gamma on this to be too low. So what this means is that any sort of bright object that you can find on the screen will get washed out, both in terms of textures, but then also the color as well. And bear in mind, I'm using the absolute lowest brightness settings available on this device. And so yeah, I was pretty bummed out by this. You know, we have a very reflective screen that's kind of washed out, and these two factors really mar the fact that we have a nice big screen with a high resolution. And to top it off, if you try to make it any brighter, it'll get even more washed out. Now thankfully, there's not a huge range between the dimmest and brightest setting, which is also negative on its own, but at least it doesn't get super washed out. Either way, this is one of the first things I noticed when I picked up the AYANEO Kun that really took away from that ultimate experience. Now, there are some benefits to having a much larger screen. For example, if you want to play real-time strategy games or something else that has very small characters, this 8.4-inch screen will help you out. For example, here I'm playing this game at a full 1600p scaling, and this essentially means we're playing the game at 1440p, but because it has an aspect ratio of 16:10, it's a little bit taller. And so that's where we get those 1600 vertical pixels. So in some regards, yes, the screen is very good, but there are other factors that keep it from being ultimate. Next, I want to talk about size and weight, and this isn't really a good or bad thing, but really just a showcase of what you're going to be getting into if you happen to pick up this device. And of course, I think that the people most interested in it are people who want to have that large screen experience. And this definitely provides that. For example, it is around the same size as the Steam Deck, maybe a little bit taller, but you can see that 8.4-inch screen is much larger than the Steam Deck's. It's the same thing with the ROG Ally. If you want something larger and more impressive, then yeah, I think the AYANEO Kun will fit that bill. Now the screen is slightly larger than other 8-inch devices like the AOK Zoe A1 Pro, but between the two I think I would prefer the AYANEO Kun just because we have those really excellent controls. The only other device I have that is comparably larger than the AYANEO Kun is this crazy TJD device that I reviewed a few weeks back. This one has a 10-inch screen and a litany of problems, so I don't really think it's worth comparing anyway. Now in terms of weight, we're looking at 950 grams, that is over 2 pounds, that is pretty darn heavy. For example, that's nearly 300 grams heavier than the Steam Deck. In fact, the only device I have that's heavier than it is that crazy TJD one. To put it into perspective, it is 200 grams heavier than a Nintendo Switch OLED edition with its dock. And it's also over 100 grams heavier than the Steam Deck with a full kill switch case on. So if having a heavy handheld is something you don't really look forward to, then I don't think the AYANEO Kun is going to be a good fit for your use case. Now that being said, I have found ways to make this work. Like I mentioned before, I do like playing it in a tabletop kind of mode. I also found that holding it at elbow height is pretty good. I can probably do about 10-15 minutes of this before I need to take a break. And there's a couple ways I found to take that break. One is to rest my elbows on my legs like this, although I did find that this puts the screen a little bit too close to my face for comfort. You can also just kind of rest it on your lap, but I did find that looking down at this angle over time does kind of hurt my neck. Either way, I think you've got a few different ways that you can hold this device. The one way I found that I just really couldn't do is holding it at kind of a shoulder height. Here I can probably play for about 5 minutes before I feel like I need to take a break. And of course, bear in mind that I moonlight as a professional bodybuilder, so you may not have the guns that I do. Now in terms of software, it's a pretty seamless experience. They're using ISpace 2, which I've featured on other videos before. But essentially you can press that hotkey button and bring up a quick menu and do things like adjusting the performance metrics. They've got a couple pre-built ones, but personally I just like to tweak the TDP myself. And like I mentioned, it goes all the way up to 54 watts, which is pretty insane for a handheld. They also have the smart TDP function. This is basically an auto TDP, and this will adjust the power profile to reach whatever frame rate you're trying to get to. Now, it's not a perfect solution. I think that it's not quite as responsive as something like the Steam Deck, but all the same, if you want a more plug and play experience, this is the feature I would recommend. You'll lose a little bit of power along the way, but with a 75 watt hour battery, you may not notice it. Now, a couple other features that are pretty handy are a performance overlay if you want to track your stats, and you can also tweak the fan configuration to whatever you'd like. In addition to performance tweaks, you can also go and just make your standard changes, things like the brightness and volume. And you also have a full range of controller functions within the quick menu. So here you can adjust things like the strength of the rumble motors, as well as assigning your function keys and then adjusting dead zones for both the triggers and the analog sticks. And like with the other AYANEO devices, you can adjust the RGB lighting and it's pretty easy to set up. However, one new addition is that you can change the RGB lighting on the AYANEO button itself. So this is a small but kind of nice little tweak. And another nice little tweak is that you can disable the controller if you would like. This will be especially handy if you want to play this device in docked mode. So if you connect with an external controller, you're not going to have conflicts with the inbuilt controls. That means your external controller will always be player one, giving you a more seamless docked experience. And given the fact that they've unlocked all the way up to a 54 watt TDP, I think that this is going to be to your advantage when playing it in docked mode. And even at that higher power profile, I found that it stayed really cool. In fact, I never really saw it get above about 83 degrees Celsius altogether. So even though I wouldn't recommend playing games at a max TDP when on battery, this can make a pretty nice docked solution. Okay, now let's do some performance tests, starting with PC games. Now, we've tested this chipset to death at this point, but I do want to show how it works specifically with the AYANEO Kun. When it comes to lightweight games, you can probably get away with about a 10 watt TDP for most of these games, even at a 1600p resolution, and these games look great. Also, when it comes to some older games, things that I wouldn't consider to be modern AAA titles, these also will play pretty well, even at a 1600p resolution. And for many of these games, I think you can probably get away with an 18 watt TDP like I am here with Grid. However, as you start working your way up, you'll probably run into issues when it comes to performance. For example, with Baldur's Gate 3 here at 1600p resolution and low settings, the absolute bare minimum that I found to make it playable was 25 watt TDP. Now, like I showed in my battery testing segment, this still will give you a little bit less than 2 hours of gameplay, so that's still pretty great. However, I wouldn't really recommend pushing it beyond this when in battery mode. For example, here's a full 54 watt TDP with that exact same game. And the average frame rate went from about 35 frames per second at 25 watts to about 41 frames per second at 54 watts. So essentially we have pushed about double the power that we can into this device, and we're only gaining about 5 or 6 frames per second. So for me, that is a diminishing return. I would keep it around 25 watts. Now, in addition to lowering the graphical settings, you often will have to use FSR if you want to have that full 1600p resolution. And the experience will really depend on the game. So for example, with Uncharted 4, this one I think does a pretty good job with its FSR. It doesn't look too bad. And for me, this is pretty good. We're getting average of about 45, maybe 50 frames per second. Now, if you want to save a little bit more battery life, you could drop down that TDP to 15 watts and then give it a 30 frames per second cap. And I would say this is also a very enjoyable experience. Now, if you don't want to fiddle around with the settings for every single game, I think that actually 1200p is going to be your standard resolution. And this is essentially a 1080p resolution, but because we have a 16:10 aspect ratio, we have those higher vertical pixels. And of course, these settings are very personal. Do you want to have something like a 30 frames per second cap to give you a more cinematic experience? Or do you want to have a 60 frames per second experience no matter what, even if you have to drop down the resolution to something like 900p? I think the main benefit of the AYANEO Kun is that we have all of those things to work with. We've got a big screen so we can adjust the resolution as we see fit, and we've also got a powerful chipset which is up to the task of playing these PC games. And of course we have that larger battery which will give us a buffer no matter what performance parameters we want to focus on. Okay, so that's really about it for PC gaming. I really just wanted to show that yeah, you can play just about everything on here, but you will have to configure the settings based on your own personal taste. Next, let's quickly go over emulation. We'll start with Nintendo GameCube and PlayStation 2. These can play at a 3x resolution, which is going to be somewhere around 1440p, and you don't have to throw a lot of power at it, about a 12 watt TDP, which will give you almost 5 hours of battery life. So if you prefer to play these systems on a larger screen, then yeah, this might work out pretty well. Now we're not going to hit every system in the book, but I did want to go over a couple highlights. For example, with Nintendo Wii U, this one will also play at a 12 watt TDP, but if you'd like, you can also upscale it to really max out that performance. So if we take Breath of the Wild, which is the hardest Wii U game to emulate, I actually upscaled it to a 1600p resolution, but with a 25 watt TDP in order to make sure I had a good frame rate. And the result is not perfect. We're getting about an average of 35 frames per second, but still very playable. For me personally, I would probably drop this down to 1080p and get something closer to 60 frames per second. Now another emulation highlight with this chipset is PlayStation 3. I found that between a 15 and 18 watt TDP will play just about any game that you can try. I generally will play these at a native resolution just because upscaling will present all sorts of graphical issues, but if you are looking for a handheld PlayStation 3, then yes, this will fit that bill easily. And then like I've demonstrated in other videos, Nintendo Switch emulation will also work very well. I generally will put this at a 25 watt TDP in docked mode and then let the emulator itself figure out how much power it needs. Either way, I would say that just about any Nintendo Switch game will play on this handheld no problem. Now earlier I talked about that 54 watt TDP and how it kind of has a diminishing return in terms of performance. But one aspect that is really to the advantage of this power profile is non-gaming tasks. That means if you want to use this PC like an actual workstation, like a home computer, this is really up to that task. So I think the ability to push the CPU that far does put it at an advantage over other handhelds in the fact that it can work as a PC replacement. Let me give you a quick example. I'm going to go into DaVinci Resolve, I'm going to grab one of my older videos, and I'm going to cut it up a bunch and then shrink it down to 1 minute. I'm also going to move around all these segments to kind of trip up the machine, and I'm also going to add some video transitions and titles just to make things a little bit more complex. From there, I'm going to export this as a 1 minute 1080p 60 frames per second YouTube video. And my threshold here for good PC performance is that it can render this video in less time than the actual runtime. That means I want to process this video in under 60 seconds. And it's hard to see in this footage here, but it passed it with flying colors, 38 seconds to render 1 minute. And I think this is probably the single best advantage of having that 54 watt TDP is that you can use this as a PC replacement. Okay, this video is way longer than I was hoping it would be, so let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Kun. And there are a lot of things that I really like about it. I think that the controls on this device are some of the best that AYANEO has ever released. In particular, the D-pad, the face buttons, and the triggers are all outstanding. I also think that they did a very good job with the ergonomics. It is very similar to the Steam Deck in design, and despite being pretty heavy, it's still very pleasurable to use. And also thanks to that 75 watt-hour battery, we've got some great battery life. The fact that we can get over 3.5 hours of gameplay time at an 18 watt TDP is pretty impressive. I also appreciate the fact that they unlocked a 54 watt TDP cap. It's not really going to make a huge difference when it comes to gaming, but when using it for non-gaming tasks, that does kind of turn this into a PC replacement. I also like the fact that they improved the audio, and the cooling profile on this is pretty great too. There's never a time where this device felt hot in my hands, no matter how hard I pushed it. Now, you knew this was coming, but there are some things I don't like about the AYANEO Kun that kind of prevent it from being the ultimate device. Number one are those touchpads. Honestly, I kind of wish that they just didn't put them in there at all. They really don't enhance the experience for me, and if anything, they're just more of a distraction. I also think that there's some work to be done on the gamma configuration of this screen. Everything has a more washed out feeling, way more than I was expecting. Another factor worth considering is the price point. This starts at $1,000 but goes up to $1,700. So if we take that very low end tier of $1,000 for the 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, And if we compare it to the best value handheld in the market right now, which is the low-end Steam Deck at $400, obviously the comparison here is apples and oranges given the fact that we have different resolutions and storage space, but all the same, when taken as a whole, I do not see the $600 price difference between these two actually being worth it. You can literally buy 2.5 low-end Steam Decks for the price of the low-end AYANEO Kun. Now that isn't to say that the AYANEO Kun is a ripoff or not worth that price point, but you do have to take into consideration what that money will actually get you. At that price point, I would expect something to be basically the best thing that is possible, but like I showed earlier in this video, it is not ultimate in some very key ways. And I think when it comes down to it, there are some use cases where the AYANEO Kun really shines. In particular, if you want something with a large screen and a large battery, but also nice controls, this is probably the best out there right now. So if those are really important to you, then yeah, this might be worth it, especially if this is within your own budget. Now for me personally, I am a more budget-minded person, and so I think this is still way outside of my pay grade. But I will say that in many ways, this was a pretty incredible experience, especially with that high-end model here with 4 terabytes of storage. With this device, I could literally install a dozen high-end games and play any of them anytime. And with 75 watts of battery behind it, I had zero battery anxiety at any time. So while I don't think that this device is a perfect fit for my own use case, I can still see why many people are going to be excited about this one. And when taken as a whole, yeah, I think this is a great handheld and one of the best that AYANEO has done. There are definitely still some things that they can improve upon, and knowing this company, they're going to have new devices coming out like every month. And as a result, I'm going to be really interested in checking in about a year from now and seeing how many things have evolved from today. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Obviously, a lot of people are going to say this is way too expensive, but I'm most interested in hearing when you actually think this might be a good fit. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.